North American video game crash occurred in the years of 1983 and 1984, when American consumers lost interest in their home video game consoles like the Atari 2600. Consumers were given too many choices like the Intellivision, Vectrex, and the Sears Telegame system. And even with a seemingly endless library of games, consumers lost interest, and many felt that the home video game industry was doomed forever. The Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, was introduced to the United States market in 1985 and single-handedly revitalized the entire home video game industry. With over 60 million of these things sold worldwide, the NES was clearly the market leader in the mid to late 1980s. Everybody seemed to have one of these things. Let's take a look at what makes this thing so cool. Now, back in the day, I was actually an Atari 7800 man because my parents said I could have one video game console, and I went with the Atari 7800 because I had an Atari 2600 previously. Most of my friends had the NES, and take a look at this thing. Now, if you're used to Atari, that was pretty cool that you could take games and slide it in the front, had a little thing you could push down, shut the door, which served no real purpose, but it looked cool, hit the power button, and admittedly it worked somewhat better than the Atari 2600 or 7800 from that standpoint. Now, my unit has seen some wear and tear over the years, as you can see, and actually this unit's been refurbished to make all the connectors inside work, so now it works perfectly. None of my Ataris have had to be refurbished. They still work after 25, practically 30 years. As far as I know, most of the Nintendo Entertainment Systems were packaged with Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt, which was a major selling point and the real beginning of what we call the platformer video game. From a design standpoint, this thing is actually quite remarkable. I love that it has a little grippy thing here, so you can grip your cartridges and easily pull them in and out of your Nintendo, which was actually quite handy back when we were like 10. And the up and down mechanism was very nice. Little door did keep dust out, for what that's worth. I hate Atari. Admittedly, it was better styled than the competing Atari 7800, but from a build quality standpoint, the Atari remains superior. However, from a sales standpoint, the Nintendo Entertainment System handed the Atari its own ass and then kicked the shit out of it, lit it on fire, and then threw it out the window. The NES controller was pretty revolutionary and certainly a lot better than the Atari controllers at the time. First time I'd ever seen a gamepad like this. We had a little thumb pad here, select, start, A, B buttons. And although this seems pretty crude by today's standards when we're used to the PlayStation and Sega Genesis controllers and Xbox and whatnot, it's a little uncomfortable for adult hands now since it has all square corners and whatnot. But back in the day, this was pretty nice, and you could play this for a long time, and even today it still holds up pretty nicely and is a generally decent controller. Not the best one out there, but far from the worst either. In fact, the worst controller is the American Atari 7800 controller, which just sucked. Now let's look at the business end of the NES. This is the power cord, and unlike the Ataris, this thing gave you two different options on how to send your audio and video signals to your television. You could either use the old school RF adapter, which would send the audio and video over one cable together into your television. And this was by far the worst way to do this and gave you pretty low quality, which is a shame because that's all the Ataris had. But this thing also gives you some outputs on the side that go directly into your television. Now, most TVs back in the day had a mono sound, not stereo. Today we have stereo televisions for the most part, and you can get a splitter which will send your mono audio signal into the left and right channels. Now, it won't be stereo per se, but you'll at least get mono on the left and right speakers. And this thing has pretty remarkable audio and video for a 20-plus-year-old game system. So, Nintendo certainly deserves a lot of praise for designing this very well. One of the things that made Nintendo games so cool is that they came with their own little sleeves. so you could take the game out of the sleeve to play it, put it back into the sleeve for safekeeping. It provided some protection from the elements. Now, not only were the Nintendo games much larger than the competing Atari 2600 and 7800 games, but they seemed more important in a way because they had to be protected by this rugged plastic sleeve. No video game system is worth squat without a library of video games to play on it, and owners of the NES were not disappointed. They had hundreds of games to choose from, most of which were far more advanced than the games that had come out a few years earlier. There were great side-scrollers and action-adventure games like Blaster Master, Ninja Gaiden, Bionic Commando, Life Force, Akari Warriors, and Super Mario Bros. The NES also came with some awesome accessories like the NES Advantage, with an old-school arcade-style joystick which was actually very well designed. Huge buttons, the turbo buttons up top, which were nice. You could actually adjust them here for varying degrees of turbo fire, like in Contra, for instance. Slow motion. This thing's built like a brick, too. If you got mad at somebody after a competitive game, you could hit them in the head with this and it would really hurt. The big question is, how does the NES compare to the Xbox 360? The NES and the Xbox 360 actually share many things in common. For one thing, they both have exterior shells that are made of a light-colored plastic. Both have exceptional styling, but somewhat questionable build quality. Many people have complained about their Xboxes breaking. I personally have not experienced that. And as I said earlier, my Nintendo Entertainment System has required refurbishing to play, unlike the Atari 2600, which has not required any maintenance over the past 25 years. In fact, it's difficult to find an NES that is in perfect working order today, and you're fortunate if you have one. The Xbox 360 was released in late 2005, which is almost exactly 20 years after the Nintendo Entertainment System was brought to market in America. Although the Xbox 360 does not have a monopoly on the market like the NES did back in its heyday, it does have an enormous selection of games, over 400, and hundreds more still being released. Although it's difficult to find an original gray NES in perfect working order today, people are still making replica systems that play the games perfectly. And you can also have your old NES refurbished at a moderate cost. It's unclear if the Xbox 360 will be working perfectly 20 years from now. For pure build quality and longevity, the Ataris and the Sega Genesis still win out. Ideally, you should own them both, because who doesn't like to play the original Akari Warriors, Super Mario Bros., and Blaster Master, games that are not available on the Xbox 360. Additionally, the NES is the perfect size to fit conveniently on top of your Xbox 360 while leaving room for the ventilation slots on the side of the console, which is why I recommend owning both of these units. The Xbox 360 and the NES are two great game systems that go well together. The only drawback is that the NES Advantage will not work with the Xbox 360. Somebody needs to find a way to solve that problem.